It was a cold December evening in the small town of Willowbrook. The streets were covered in a thin layer of snow, and the air was filled with the scent of pine trees and burning firewood. The town was quiet, as it always was during the winter months. But this December was different. This December, there was a mystery that needed solving. Detective James Carter was sitting in his small office, sipping on a cup of hot coffee. He was a tall man with sharp blue eyes and a keen sense of observation. He had solved many cases in his career, but this one was proving to be more challenging than most. The case was the death of Mr. Henry Blackwood, a wealthy businessman who had been found dead in his mansion on the outskirts of town. The police had ruled it as a suicide, but Detective Carter wasn't convinced. There were too many unanswered questions, and he was determined to find the truth. The first thing that struck Detective Carter as odd was the note that had been found next to Mr. Blackwood's body. It was a simple note that read, "I'm sorry." But the handwriting didn't match Mr. Blackwood's. It was too neat, too precise. Mr. Blackwood's handwriting was known to be messy and hurried. This was the first clue that something wasn't right. Detective Carter decided to visit the Blackwood mansion to investigate further. The mansion was a large old building with tall windows and a grand staircase. It was clear that Mr. Blackwood had been a man of great wealth. But as Detective Carter walked through the halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He started by interviewing the staff. The first person he spoke to was Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper. She had been with the Blackwood family for over 20 years and was clearly upset by Mr. Blackwood's death. "He was a good man," she said, wiping away a tear. "I can't believe he would do something like this." Detective Carter asked her about the note, but she claimed she had never seen it before. She also mentioned that Mr. Blackwood had been acting strangely in the days leading up to his death. He had been more withdrawn, more secretive. Next, Detective Carter spoke to Mr. Blackwood's son, Edward. Edward was a young man in his early 20s, with a sharp tongue and a cold demeanor. He didn't seem too upset by his father's death, which Detective Carter found suspicious. "My father and I didn't get along," Edward said bluntly. "We had our differences. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking." Detective Carter didn't say anything, but he made a mental note to keep an eye on Edward. The last person he interviewed was Mr. Blackwood's business partner, Mr. Samuel Gray. Mr. Gray was a middle-aged man with a friendly smile and a firm handshake. He seemed genuinely saddened by Mr. Blackwood's death. "Henry was a good friend," Mr. Gray said. "We've been through a lot together. I can't believe he's gone." Detective Carter asked him about the note, and Mr. Gray's reaction was surprising. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "I don't know anything about that." This hesitation made Detective Carter suspicious. He decided to dig deeper into Mr. Gray's background and discovered that Mr. Gray had been in financial trouble. He owed a lot of money, and Mr. Blackwood had recently refused to lend him any more. This was the breakthrough Detective Carter needed. He confronted Mr. Gray with the evidence, and after some intense questioning, Mr. Gray finally broke down and confessed. "I didn't mean to kill him," Mr. Gray said, tears streaming down his face. "I just wanted to scare him. I thought if I left that note, he would think twice about cutting me off. But things got out of hand, and I panicked." Detective Carter listened quietly as Mr. Gray explained how he had staged the suicide to cover up the murder. It was a tragic end to a case that had started with so many questions. As Detective Carter left the Blackwood mansion that night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. The death of Mr. Henry Blackwood was a reminder that even in a small town like Willowbrook, darkness could lurk beneath the surface. But for now, the mystery was solved and Detective Carter could finally rest. The snow continued to fall, covering the town in a blanket of white, as if trying to hide the secrets that had been uncovered. But Detective Carter knew that in a town like Willowbrook, there would always be another mystery waiting to be solved.